Before the blade, there was the table. Before the scaffold, there was the meal plan. In the modern imagination, the relationship between imprisonment and execution is understood primarily through law, judgment, and finality. What is less examined, and considerably more deliberate, is the period between sentencing and death, and the institutional management of the prisoner's body during that interval. The revolutionary prison systems of the 18th and 19th centuries developed, in several cases, specific dietary protocols for condemned prisoners that were not incidental to execution logistics. They were designed to serve them. And this documentary examines a specific and underanalyzed intersection: the use of diet as an administrative instrument in revolutionary-era carceral systems, and the ways in which nutritional control over condemned prisoners was structured to achieve practical execution outcomes. The question is not whether this was cruel. The question is how it was rationalized, designed, and institutionalized, and what that process reveals about how revolutionary states understood the bodies in their custody. To understand the practice, it helps to understand the problem it was solving. Public execution in revolutionary France, and in the broader European context of the late 18th century, was increasingly subject to scrutiny, not initially on humanitarian grounds, but on grounds of public order and administrative efficiency. Would an execution that went poorly, through physical resistance, through a condemned person whose physical condition made mechanical procedures uncertain, was a problem for the institution. It was a spectacle that inverted the intended message. Revolutionary France is the most documented case study for this analysis, and it will serve as our anchor throughout. The period between the fall of the monarchy in 1792 and the end of the Thermidorian reaction in 1795, the period retrospectively called the Terror in its most acute phase, produced a scale of judicial execution unprecedented in modern European history. The specific numbers remain subject to ongoing scholarly debate. But the institutional infrastructure required to process that scale created pressures that shaped administrative practice in traceable ways. The Conciergerie in Paris, the primary holding facility for condemned prisoners during the Terror, became the site where these administrative pressures were most concentrated. What is documented about conditions there includes not only the legal and procedural aspects of incarceration, but, in fragments, the management of the prisoner's daily life in the interval between sentencing and execution. Diet is among those fragments. The question of why diet was managed during this period requires understanding what the guillotine's operators understood about the mechanics of their process. The condemned needed to be positioned correctly on the bascule, the tilting board, secured, and positioned so that the lunette held the neck in precise alignment. Any significant variation in body weight, muscle resistance, or physical agitation affected the speed and reliability of that positioning process. The institution had an interest in predictable physical compliance. The relationship between caloric intake and physical capacity is straightforward physiology. A prisoner maintained on reduced caloric intake over a period of days or weeks will experience reduced muscle mass and strength, reduced blood pressure, and, critically, a measurable reduction in the capacity for sustained physical resistance. Revolutionary prison administrators did not articulate this in the language of modern nutritional science, but the practical understanding of what limited food did to a body was available to any person who had spent time managing confined populations, which several of those administrators had. What the historical record shows, and this is important to frame carefully because the documentation is partial and the interpretive tradition is contested, is that rations in facilities holding condemned prisoners were, in several documented cases, calibrated differently from rations in facilities holding prisoners under other categories of detention. The differences were not always dramatic in absolute terms, but they were consistent in direction: lower protein, lower total caloric density, limited in variety. Whether these differences were explicitly designed to serve execution logistics, or whether they reflected general institutional indifference combined with resource constraints, is a question historians have not resolved uniformly. What we can examine with more confidence is the reasoning that appears in administrative documents of the period, not about diet specifically, but about the management of condemned prisoners as an administrative category. These documents reflect a consistent orientation. The condemned prisoner's body was understood primarily as the object of a pending procedure. The interval between sentencing and execution was understood as a logistical interval. Within that orientation, decisions about diet were administrative decisions, not moral ones. This is the reframing the documentary asks you to hold. The dietary management of condemned prisoners was not an act of additional punishment layered on top of execution. It was, from the institutional perspective, a form of preparation, the engineering of a physical state that served the institution's operational needs. The state was not trying to cause suffering through diet, and it was trying to minimize a logistical variable. Our anchor case is the Conciergerie during the Terror, specifically the period between mid-1793 and mid-1794. This is the most documented period, coinciding with the period of highest execution volume. The documentary record includes administrative inventories, guard records, and, in a small number of cases, accounts from survivors who were held and later released or reprieved. The accounts from survivors are valuable precisely because they were not written to serve an institutional narrative. What those accounts describe, with some consistency, is a specific kind of physical decline during detention. Not acute starvation, but a gradual reduction in physical vitality that survivors described in terms of weakness and passivity. The word that appears with some frequency in these accounts, in various translations, is something like resignation, a physical and psychological state that the institution's procedures were, in effect, cultivating. Whether the administrators understood this as a direct goal or as a convenient byproduct is not fully determinable from the available record. There is a parallel worth noting from a different revolutionary context. In the Soviet carceral system of the early to mid-20th century, a system operating under different political conditions, but with comparable pressures toward procedural efficiency at scale, the management of prisoner diet was considerably more explicitly documented. The graduated ration system used in Soviet camps, in which caloric allocation was tied to labor output and institutional category, has been extensively analyzed by historians. All condemned prisoners awaiting execution occupied a specific ration category distinct from labor prisoners. The ration was not designed to maintain capacity for work. It was designed to maintain existence until a scheduled date. This parallel matters because it illustrates that what appears in the French Revolutionary record as a partially documented and somewhat ambiguous practice was, in later revolutionary systems, an explicit and formalized administrative category. The logic was consistent across different ideological contexts and different centuries. The condemned prisoner's body was a problem to be managed toward a specific physical state at a specific time, and the administrative rationalization of diet control in these systems rested on a premise that was never fully examined within the institutions themselves, that the body of the condemned prisoner was an object of procedure rather than a subject of experience. This premise did the moral work that allowed administrators to make decisions about caloric content and ration composition as technical decisions, and without confronting what those decisions meant for the person experiencing them. What the historical record suggests, again, carefully, because the documentation is fragmentary, is that this administrative premise did not fully correspond to the experience of those inside the system. The accounts of survivors, and in a smaller number of cases, the accounts of prison officials who later spoke or wrote about the period, I describe a population that was not rendered inert by the process, reduced, weakened, but present. There is an important distinction to maintain between two different institutional claims. The first is operational, that dietary management produced a physical state that made execution procedures more predictable and efficient. This has a degree of physiological basis and some evidentiary support in the administrative record. The second claim, which was sometimes implied but rarely stated explicitly, is that dietary management produced a psychological state of acceptance in condemned prisoners. The evidence for this is considerably weaker, and survivors' accounts tend to contradict it. The physical body could be weakened. The interior experience of the person was not, as far as the record shows, significantly redirected by the caloric content of their rations. This distinction is significant for what it reveals about the institutional logic. The administrators were managing a variable they could control, the physical condition of the body, in order to reduce uncertainty in a procedure they needed to execute reliably. They were not engaged in a project of preparing the condemned psychologically for death. The institution's interest was narrowly procedural. What the Conciergerie record shows, and what the comparative record from later revolutionary systems reinforces, is that once the logic of body as procedure object was institutionalized, it became self-extending. And decisions about diet were made within that logic, without requiring the logic itself to be re-examined at each decision point. The administrator filling out a ration inventory did not need to engage with the moral weight of what they were doing. The framework had already resolved that question in advance. This is what makes the practice historically interesting beyond its specific content. And it is an early and relatively well-documented instance of what we might now recognize as bureaucratic moral disengagement. The distribution of a morally weighted decision across enough procedural steps, institutional roles, and technical framings that no single person is required to hold its full weight. The physician who calculated caloric requirements was doing nutrition work, and the administrator who signed the ration order was doing logistics work. The guard who delivered the food was doing custody work. The executioner who operated the mechanism was doing procedural work. The condemned prisoner was the only person in the system who experienced the totality of what the system was doing. The revolutionary prison systems that developed these practices did not invent the underlying logic. Managing confined populations through food control has a history as long as imprisonment itself. What the revolutionary period contributed was a specific combination: the scale of the condemned population, the mechanical requirements of a new execution technology, and an administrative culture oriented toward procedural rationalism. These three elements, in combination, created the conditions for dietary management to become not merely a feature of imprisonment, but an integrated component of execution logistics. What we are left with, examining this history from the present, is a set of questions about institutional design that are not confined to the 18th century. When an institution defines a human being as the object of a procedure and structures its administrative practices around the requirements of that procedure, the category of the condemned prisoner contains a logic that can be extended. The specific technology changes. The administrative premise, that the body can be treated as a variable to be optimized toward an institutional outcome, is not a historical artifact, or it is a persistent feature of how institutions manage populations they have decided to process rather than to accommodate. The meal plan preceded the blade. The administrative logic that connected them was not exceptional to its time. It was a particularly clear expression of a logic that institutions have reproduced in different forms, whenever the body of a confined person has been understood primarily as a problem to be managed toward an outcome.